Some souls do not survive because they are stronger than the sea. They survive because someone refuses to leave them behind. Dawn had barely begun to soften the horizon off the rugged coast of Maine when Lieutenant Daniel Brooks lowered the rescue helicopter another 50 feet through a curtain of silver fog. The Atlantic below looked endless, cold enough to steal the breath from any living thing, its slow rolling swells reflecting only faint ribbons of pale morning light. The radio had fallen unusually quiet after a weak emergency beacon flickered across naval monitoring stations before disappearing again without explanation. Search crews expected to find an empty raft, scattered debris, or perhaps nothing at all. Instead, the first thing the crew saw was movement. A lone Orange Life raft drifted between the swells nearly 18 miles offshore, rising and falling with the rhythm of the ocean as though it had surrendered to the tide long before sunrise. Standing perfectly still on the bow was a German shepherd. His sable coat was soaked dark from salt water, his ears standing tall despite the relentless wind, his amber eyes fixed on the approaching helicopter without fear or panic. He neither barked nor paced. He simply watched. "I've got visual," Daniel said quietly into his headset. Life raft confirmed. At least 2 survivors. Petty Officer Noah Bennett leaned toward the open cabin door, binoculars pressed tightly against his face. "Correction," he murmured after several seconds. "1 survivor. 1 dog." As the helicopter circled lower, the scene became stranger. Curled beneath an emergency thermal blanket lay a woman, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of her breathing. She appeared to be in her early 30s, her pale face touched by exhaustion rather than injury, strands of chestnut hair clinging to her cheeks as sea mist drifted across the raft. One arm rested protectively beside a bright yellow waterproof equipment case strapped securely against the center bench. Yet the woman herself was not what held everyone's attention. The German shepherd stood directly between the rescue basket and the yellow case, his stance calm but unwavering. Each time the basket descended another few feet, he shifted slightly, never threatening, never aggressive, only placing himself where no stranger could reach the case behind him. "That's unusual," Noah whispered. "He's guarding something." Daniel nodded slowly. Not something. Someone trusted him with something. The helicopter hovered steadily overhead as rescue swimmer Ethan Morales prepared to descend. Years of service had taught him how frightened animals usually behaved after disaster. They barked. They fled. They trembled. This dog did none of those things. The shepherd held Ethan's eyes with quiet certainty, almost as if measuring whether the man deserved to come closer. Ethan touched the surface of the raft gently and spoke in the calm voice he had used with frightened survivors for over a decade. "Easy, buddy. We're here to help." The dog's ears twitched, but he did not move. His gaze shifted briefly toward the sleeping woman before returning to the yellow case, as though reminding everyone aboard the helicopter that whatever rested inside mattered just as much as the exhausted life beside it. Above them, no one spoke for several long seconds. The ocean continued its slow breathing beneath the morning fog, while every seasoned sailor aboard the aircraft realized they were looking at something they had never witnessed before. None of them yet knew the woman's name was Claire Whitmore. None of them understood why she had vanished from a Navy research vessel less than a day earlier. And none of them could possibly imagine why one faithful German shepherd named Atlas seemed willing to protect a weathered waterproof case with the same devotion he gave the woman whose life he refused to leave behind. 24 hours earlier, the Atlantic had worn a different face. The same waters that now drifted beneath a rescue helicopter had awakened beneath a clear September sky, glowing blue beneath the first light of morning as gentle waves rolled against the hull of the United States Navy research vessel Resolute. The air carried the crisp scent of salt, pine drifting from the distant Maine shoreline, and fresh coffee rising from the galley where sailors greeted another routine day at sea. Claire Whitmore stood alone near the starboard rail with one hand resting lightly against Atlas's neck. The German shepherd faced the horizon with quiet confidence, his ears lifting whenever gulls circled overhead, his tail swaying slowly with the steady rhythm of the ship beneath his paws. At 31 years old, Claire had spent nearly a decade studying the Atlantic's changing ecosystems, earning a reputation among marine researchers for noticing details others overlooked. She was not loud, nor eager for recognition. She simply believed that every current carried a story, and every discovery deserved patience before judgment. Her colleagues often joked that Atlas had become the unofficial mascot of every expedition, though everyone secretly admitted the dog seemed unusually aware of the sea itself. He rarely barked aboard the vessel. Instead, he watched. He listened. Sometimes he stared toward empty stretches of water long before sonar detected anything unusual below. Commander Nathan Hayes stepped onto the observation deck, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. At 46, his weathered face reflected decades spent serving on ships from Alaska to the Caribbean. His silver-threaded brown hair stirred gently in the breeze as he handed 1 cup to Claire with an easy smile. "Looks like the weather finally decided to cooperate," he said. Claire accepted the cup gratefully. The ocean usually rewards patience. Nathan glanced toward Atlas, who remained focused on the water instead of the people around him. "I still cannot decide whether he likes the Navy or simply tolerates us." Claire laughed softly. "He trusts people who keep their promises." Nathan smiled, but said nothing more. The answer lingered in his thoughts longer than he expected. As the morning progressed, scientists calibrated sonar equipment while Navy technicians monitored navigation systems with practiced precision. The mission itself appeared straightforward. They were mapping portions of the Gulf of Maine where shifting underwater terrain had recently produced unusual acoustic readings. Nothing classified, nothing dangerous, just another cooperative research assignment between civilian scientists and the Navy. Shortly before noon, Claire settled into the survey station, carefully reviewing streams of sonar imagery flowing across multiple screens. Atlas rested beside her chair, his head low but his eyes never fully closed. Suddenly, one display flickered with an irregular formation resting nearly 300 feet below the surface. It was not large, but its shape appeared strangely symmetrical against the surrounding seabed. Claire leaned closer, adjusting several filters before quietly marking the coordinates. "That is odd," she whispered. Atlas lifted his head immediately. His ears stood forward. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply rose to his feet and stared toward the reinforced equipment compartment located 1 deck below the laboratory. Claire followed his gaze, puzzled by the sudden change in his posture. Seconds later, Atlas walked slowly toward the compartment door, stopped, and rested his nose lightly against the cold steel without making a sound. One nearby technician looked over and chuckled. "Looks like your partner found something more interesting than our sonar." Claire smiled politely, but a quiet feeling settled deep inside her. Atlas had never behaved this way before. Whatever had captured his attention was not beneath the ocean. It was already somewhere aboard the ship. The afternoon sun drifted behind a layer of thin gray clouds, softening the light across the Atlantic until sea and sky blended into a single sheet of silver. Inside the survey laboratory, monitors hummed steadily while streams of sonar data continued flowing across the screens. Claire enlarged the unusual formation again, comparing it against geological records stored in the vessel's archive. The object remained exactly where the previous scan had placed it, resting quietly on the ocean floor nearly 300 feet below the surface. It was too symmetrical to resemble natural rock, yet too irregular to match any registered structure in the Navy's navigation database. She frowned thoughtfully and reached for another layer of imaging software. The clearer the picture became, the stranger it looked. "Commander Hayes," she called gently. Nathan stepped beside her, coffee still warming his hands. He studied the display without speaking for several moments. "Could it be an old fishing wreck?" he finally asked. Claire shook her head. "The dimensions do not match any vessel listed in this region. It almost looks like a reinforced storage unit." Nathan folded his arms. "Interesting." Before either of them could continue, Atlas quietly entered the laboratory. His paws made almost no sound against the polished deck, yet every person in the room noticed him. The German shepherd walked directly past Claire without asking for attention. His nose lifted into the air as he slowly circled the room once before stopping beside the bright yellow waterproof equipment case resting beneath Claire's workstation. He sniffed it carefully, then looked toward the sealed equipment compartment beyond the reinforced security door. His ears stiffened. His posture became perfectly still. "He is doing it again," one technician observed with a nervous smile. Claire knelt beside Atlas, gently placing a hand against his shoulder. "What is it, buddy?" Atlas leaned briefly into her touch before turning back toward the compartment, his amber eyes focused with unusual intensity. He gave one quiet whine, so soft it almost disappeared beneath the sound of the ship's engines. Claire had lived with Atlas long enough to recognize the difference between curiosity and warning. This was neither excitement nor fear. It was certainty. Nathan pressed the intercom, requesting access to the storage compartment for a routine inspection, but moments later an unfamiliar civilian supervisor answered instead. His voice remained polite, though noticeably firm. Storage access is temporarily restricted while inventory verification is underway. Please continue scheduled operations. Nathan thanked him and ended the call, but the exchange left an uncomfortable silence hanging over the laboratory. Inventory verification, he murmured. That was not on today's schedule. Claire returned her attention to the sonar images. As she adjusted another frequency, a second shape emerged several yards away from the first. It was smaller, partially buried beneath layers of sediment, but connected by a narrow trail that appeared almost deliberate. Her pulse quickened. She quickly recorded the coordinates and transferred duplicate copies onto the yellow waterproof case, an external encrypted storage system she carried on every expedition. Years of field research had taught her never to trust a single copy of important data. Atlas watched every movement without blinking. Outside, the wind strengthened, carrying colder air across the deck as distant fog slowly gathered along the horizon. Sailors continued their work, unaware that the atmosphere aboard the vessel had quietly shifted. Conversations grew shorter. Smiles appeared less often. Two crew members Claire had never seen before walked past the laboratory window, speaking in hushed voices before disappearing below deck. Nathan noticed them as well, but said nothing. He simply looked once more toward the sealed compartment before returning his eyes to Claire. Something aboard this ship has everyone acting differently, he said quietly. Claire closed the yellow case with a gentle click and rested her hand on its handle. Atlas immediately lay beside it, placing one large paw across the corner as though he had accepted a responsibility no one had asked him to carry. Beyond the windows, the peaceful Atlantic continued rolling beneath the fading afternoon light. But somewhere beneath its calm surface, and somewhere within the ship itself, unseen currents had already begun pulling every soul aboard toward a future none of them yet understood. Evening settled over the Gulf of Maine with the quiet confidence only the Atlantic could command. The last streaks of sunlight disappeared behind a wall of gathering fog, leaving the research vessel wrapped in a cool gray silence broken only by the steady hum of engines and the distant cry of seabirds returning to shore. Claire stood alone outside the laboratory, the yellow waterproof case hanging securely from her shoulder, while Atlas remained close enough that his fur brushed against her leg with every step. She had intended to enjoy the fresh air for only a few minutes before returning to her work, but the uneasy feeling that had settled over the ship refused to fade. It was not fear. It was the unmistakable sense that ordinary routines were quietly unraveling. Commander Nathan Hayes approached from the bridge wing, his expression thoughtful. I reviewed the navigation log, he said softly. There is no record explaining why access to the storage compartment was restricted today. Claire looked toward the darkening horizon before answering. Then someone changed the plan without telling you. Nathan nodded once. And I do not like surprises at sea. Before either could continue, a voice echoed across the deck requesting Claire's presence for what was described as a routine data verification meeting in one of the lower conference rooms. The request sounded ordinary enough, yet something about its timing felt strangely deliberate. Nathan offered to accompany her, but another officer intercepted him with an urgent communications report from the bridge. I will only be a few minutes, Claire said with a reassuring smile. Meet me afterward. Nathan hesitated before turning away. Do not keep me waiting. Claire descended the narrow staircase with Atlas following close behind. The corridors below deck felt unusually empty. Most doors were closed. Conversations stopped as she passed. The atmosphere had become strangely formal, almost rehearsed. When she reached the conference room, she found only two unfamiliar civilian administrators waiting inside. Their smiles were polite but distant. One gestured toward a chair, while the other quietly closed the door. Dr. Whitmore, the older man began. During today's survey there appears to have been an unexpected duplication of classified mapping files. We simply need to verify where those copies were stored. Claire blinked in surprise. The survey was not classified. It was a cooperative environmental mission. The man folded his hands calmly. Certain discoveries change classification. Claire rested one hand on the yellow case. The data belongs to the research program until formal review is completed. Silence filled the room. Atlas stepped closer to Claire without making a sound. His eyes remained fixed on the two men. Finally, the younger administrator spoke. For everyone's peace of mind, we will hold the storage device temporarily. Claire's voice remained calm. I cannot release scientific evidence without written authorization. Neither man argued. Instead, they exchanged a brief glance before thanking her for her cooperation and opening the door. The conversation had ended as quietly as it had begun, yet nothing felt resolved. Minutes later, alarms did not sound, but activity across the ship suddenly accelerated. Crew members hurried between stations while the vessel adjusted course several degrees east. Nathan finally reached Claire near the stern, concern written plainly across his face. Something is wrong, he said. Orders just came down transferring you off the vessel because of an administrative dispute. I challenged them, but they came from above my authority. Claire stared at him in disbelief. Transferred? Out here. Nathan looked toward a small emergency life raft already being lowered beside the ship. His shoulders sank beneath the weight of words he clearly did not wish to speak. They insist another vessel will retrieve you within the hour. Claire knew the weather forecast. Fog was thickening. Visibility was falling. No approaching lights appeared anywhere across the darkening Atlantic. She stepped into the gently rocking raft with the yellow case secured against her side, refusing to abandon the work she had spent years building. Before anyone could react, Atlas sprang over the rail in one effortless motion, landing beside her with a splash of seawater across the raft's floor. He pressed himself against Claire's shoulder as the release line slipped free. Neither bark nor cry escaped him. He simply sat beside her, watching the research vessel slowly disappear into the deepening fog, while the cold Atlantic carried them farther into a silence that no one aboard seemed willing to break. Darkness arrived completely within the hour, swallowing the last outline of the research vessel until even its navigation lights disappeared behind a wall of drifting fog. Claire sat quietly inside the small life raft with one arm wrapped around the bright yellow waterproof case, while Atlas remained awake beside her, facing the open Atlantic as though he had accepted the night watch without being asked. The ocean breathed in slow, endless rhythms beneath them, lifting the raft gently before letting it settle again. Every few minutes the wind shifted, carrying the scent of salt, seaweed, and distant rain across the empty water. Claire looked toward the place where the ship had vanished, hoping to catch even the faintest glow returning through the mist, but there was nothing except darkness stretching from one horizon to the other. She checked the emergency radio again. Silence answered. She tried the locator beacon once more. A single green light flashed before disappearing into the night. Someone will find us, she whispered, though the words sounded more like a promise she hoped to believe than a certainty. Atlas turned his head toward her voice, gently resting the side of his face against her shoulder for only a moment before returning his attention to the sea. His quiet confidence steadied her breathing more effectively than any reassuring sentence could have done. Hours passed slowly. The temperature dropped until every breath became visible in the damp night air. Claire unfolded another emergency blanket across Atlas's back, but the German shepherd nudged it toward her instead, refusing to keep the extra warmth for himself. She smiled despite everything and carefully shared it across both of them. You have always been stubborn, she said softly. Atlas answered only with the slow sweep of his tail against the floor of the raft. Near midnight, light rain began falling across the Atlantic, tapping gently against the inflated sides of the raft with a rhythm almost peaceful despite their uncertain future. Claire opened the emergency supply pack, carefully rationing a small bottle of fresh water and 2 energy bars. She broke one into equal pieces. Atlas accepted his share politely before lowering himself beside the yellow case once again. He positioned both front paws against it exactly as he had aboard the ship, never allowing it to drift even an inch away from Claire. She noticed the gesture immediately. You really do not want to let that go, do you? Atlas looked into her eyes without moving. It was the same look he had given the sealed storage compartment earlier that afternoon. Calm. Certain. unwavering. Claire rested her hand against the waterproof case and felt an unexpected sense of responsibility settle over her. Whatever had changed aboard the vessel had begun after those sonar images appeared. Whatever frightened people enough to remove her from the mission somehow connected to the information resting inside this simple yellow container. The thought lingered quietly as fatigue slowly pulled at her mind. She closed her eyes for only a few moments before Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears stood high against the wind. He stared into the darkness beyond the raft, listening to something Claire could not hear. She held her breath. The ocean remained silent. No engines, no voices, only distant waves meeting unseen rocks somewhere beyond the fog. After nearly a minute, Atlas relaxed again, though he never abandoned his place beside the case. Dawn finally arrived as a faint silver line spreading across the eastern horizon. Claire had slept little, yet Atlas had barely rested at all. His eyes remained alert, scanning every movement across the empty Atlantic while the raft drifted wherever the current chose to carry it. Claire reached down and scratched gently behind his ears. "I always thought I was the one protecting you," she whispered with tired gratitude. Atlas leaned into her hand for a single quiet second before returning his watch over both the woman beside him and the yellow case resting safely beneath his faithful paws, as though he understood that the longest journey was only just beginning. The second morning arrived beneath a sky the color of weathered steel, where the sun existed only as a pale circle struggling through layers of drifting fog. Claire slowly opened her eyes to the quiet sound of gentle waves brushing against the life raft. Every muscle ached from the cold night, yet the first thing she noticed was Atlas. He had not changed his position. The German shepherd still sat beside the yellow waterproof case with his broad shoulders facing the open sea, watching the endless horizon with patient determination. Salt crystals clung to his dark fur, and exhaustion showed in his eyes, but his posture never surrendered. Claire reached for the emergency radio once more. Static answered her again. She released a slow breath and turned off the receiver to preserve what little battery remained. "One more day," she whispered softly. "We only need one chance." Atlas looked back at her for a moment before lifting his nose toward the wind. His ears suddenly stood upright. His body became perfectly still. Claire had learned to trust that silence. She listened carefully. At first there was nothing except the ocean. Then, somewhere beyond the fog, came the faint rhythmic pulse of rotor blades. It was distant enough to disappear beneath the wind before returning once more, stronger than before. Claire stood carefully inside the gently rocking raft and removed the emergency signal mirror from the supply pack. Atlas remained fixed on the same point in the mist, as though he could already see what she could not. The sound grew louder. A dark silhouette slowly emerged through the gray sky. A United States Navy search and rescue helicopter descended cautiously above the waves, its searchlight sweeping across the water until the brilliant beam finally rested upon the small, orange raft drifting below. Relief flooded Claire's tired face. She raised both arms and waved the mirror toward the aircraft as tears quietly filled her eyes. "We are here," she whispered. "Thank God." The helicopter circled once before settling into a steady hover overhead. Spray lifted from the ocean beneath the powerful rotors as rescue swimmer Ethan Morales prepared to descend. Suspended by the rescue cable, he reached the raft with practiced precision and offered Claire a reassuring smile. "You are safe now," he said warmly. "We are going to bring you home." Claire nodded gratefully, but before Ethan could secure the rescue harness, Atlas stepped calmly between him and the yellow waterproof case. The dog did not growl. He did not bare his teeth. He simply stood there with quiet resolve, blocking the path exactly as he had done aboard the research vessel. Ethan paused immediately. Years of rescue work had taught him that animals often sense things people overlooked. He slowly lowered his hands and spoke gently. "Easy, buddy. Nobody is taking anything away from her." Atlas never looked at Ethan. His eyes remained fixed upon the case. Above them, Lieutenant Daniel Brooks watched through the open cabin door with growing curiosity. "He is protecting that container," Daniel said over the intercom. Petty Officer Noah Bennett nodded. "Not the food. Not the water. Only that case." Ethan glanced toward Claire. "May I ask what is inside?" Claire rested her trembling hand on the yellow case before answering. "Research data. Copies of sonar records from yesterday. I do not know why anyone would care about them, but everything changed after we found something beneath the ocean. Ethan looked thoughtfully at Atlas before speaking into his radio. Lieutenant, I recommend we recover the survivor and the equipment together. The dog seems convinced it matters. Daniel answered without hesitation. Approved. Bring all three. Ethan smiled softly. Looks like your partner just made the decision for all of us. Claire reached down and gently touched Atlas's neck. For the first time since they had drifted into the Atlantic, the German shepherd relaxed. His tail moved once across the floor of the raft before he quietly stepped aside, never taking his eyes from the yellow case, as the rescue harness slowly lifted all three of them above the cold gray sea toward answers that had waited patiently beyond the fog. The rescue helicopter banked gently toward the Naval Air Station as the coastline of Maine slowly emerged through the thinning fog. Rocky cliffs, evergreen forests, and weathered lighthouses appeared one by one beneath the morning sun, welcoming them back to solid ground. Inside the cabin, Claire sat wrapped in a warm blanket while Atlas rested quietly at her feet, refusing to let the yellow waterproof case drift farther than a few inches from his reach. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks had watched military working dogs throughout his career, but never had he witnessed one remain so completely devoted to an object after its owner was already safe. Every few minutes Atlas glanced toward Claire, then back to the case, as though reminding himself that both responsibilities remained equally important. The moment the helicopter landed, a small reception team guided Claire toward the medical unit for routine evaluation. She cooperated politely, but paused when two logistics officers reached for the yellow case. Before anyone else could react, Atlas calmly stepped between them again. He neither barked nor growled. He simply stood there with quiet dignity, his steady amber eyes making it impossible to mistake his intention. One of the officers smiled awkwardly. I think he has adopted that box. Daniel shook his head. No, he believes he was entrusted with it. Commander Rebecca Collins, the senior officer overseeing the rescue response, observed the scene from several feet away. She had spent more than 20 years making difficult decisions, and experience had taught her to pay attention whenever something refused to fit ordinary explanations. She approached Atlas slowly before kneeling to his level. May we look at it together? She asked softly. Atlas looked toward Claire instead of answering with movement. Claire nodded gently. It is all right, buddy. Only then did Atlas step aside. Rebecca noticed the hesitation immediately. He waited for your permission. Claire smiled faintly. He always does. The yellow case was carefully carried into a secure conference room where only a handful of senior personnel gathered around the polished wooden table. Outside the windows, gulls drifted above the harbor while sunlight reflected across calm blue water, a peaceful contrast to the uncertainty filling the room. Claire entered with Atlas close behind. She unlocked the waterproof latches one by one until the lid slowly opened. Inside rested several encrypted storage drives, printed survey logs sealed in protective sleeves, handwritten field notes, and a small waterproof pouch containing biological samples collected during the expedition. Rebecca carefully lifted the first storage drive. May we review these? Claire nodded. Everything I recorded yesterday is there. Within minutes, the files appeared across the conference room display. Detailed sonar maps revealed the mysterious underwater structure exactly as Claire had discovered it. Additional processing exposed something even more remarkable. The formation was not simply an isolated object resting beneath the Atlantic. It appeared connected to an older network of reinforced containers partially buried beneath decades of sediment. Their arrangement suggesting an intentionally protected scientific storage site dating back many years. Claire quietly explained her observations. These are not military assets. The sonar signatures match sealed environmental archives. Someone preserved ocean research here decades ago, possibly to protect fragile biological records before digital networks became reliable. Rebecca looked thoughtfully at the expanding images. If these archives had been disturbed or removed without proper study, years of environmental history could have disappeared forever. Another specialist carefully examined the biological samples. His eyes widened with quiet amazement. These organisms were believed extinct along this section of the Atlantic coastline nearly 40 years ago. Silence settled over the room. The value of the discovery became clear to everyone present. This was never about hidden treasure or secret weapons. It was about knowledge, about protecting decades of scientific work that could reshape understanding of the Gulf of Maine for generations to come. Rebecca slowly closed the yellow case before looking toward Atlas, who remained lying beside Claire's chair with peaceful confidence. He stayed beside this through cold, darkness, and open water, she said quietly. Daniel nodded. He knew it mattered long before any of us did. Claire reached down, gently resting her hand upon Atlas's head. The German shepherd closed his eyes for a brief moment, finally allowing himself to relax. He had never understood encrypted files, sonar images, or scientific archives. He had understood only one simple truth. The person he loved believed this small yellow case was worth protecting. And for Atlas, that reason alone had always been enough. The days that followed unfolded with a quiet honesty that no official report could fully capture. Investigators reviewed communication logs, navigation records, and transfer orders from the research vessel, carefully placing each event into its proper place until the confusing pieces finally formed a clear picture. The decision to remove Claire from the mission had not followed established procedure. Miscommunication, poor judgment, and unauthorized administrative actions had combined to create a chain of mistakes that should never have happened aboard a vessel dedicated to science and service. Commander Rebecca Collins insisted that every finding remain transparent, not because anyone wished to assign blame, but because trust at sea depended upon accountability. Claire never asked for revenge. She asked only that the truth be preserved with the same care she had given the research itself. Weeks later, the official review concluded. Her professional record was fully restored, her scientific work formally recognized, and the Underwater Environmental Archive received immediate federal protection so future researchers could study it responsibly. Commander Nathan Hayes visited Claire after the announcement, carrying a folder beneath one arm and an expression that spoke before his words did. "I should have stopped it," he said quietly. Claire looked out toward the harbor where fishing boats drifted peacefully beneath a bright autumn sky. "You tried," she answered gently. "Sometimes doing the right thing begins with refusing to hide what happened afterward." Nathan nodded slowly. The weight he had carried since that evening seemed a little lighter. Across the naval station, word of Atlas had spread farther than anyone expected. Sailors paused to greet him during morning walks. Mechanics scratched behind his ears before beginning their shifts. Even seasoned rescue swimmers smiled whenever the German shepherd appeared along the pier beside Claire. They admired him not because he had performed an extraordinary trick, but because he had demonstrated something many people spend a lifetime trying to learn. Loyalty did not require recognition. It required consistency. One crisp morning, Lieutenant Daniel Brooks invited Claire and Atlas to a small gathering near the rescue hangar. There were no television cameras, no grand speeches, and no elaborate ceremony. A handful of Navy personnel stood together beneath an American flag moving gently in the coastal breeze. Commander Rebecca Collins stepped forward holding a simple wooden display case. Inside rested a polished brass challenge coin engraved with the emblem of the rescue squadron alongside a custom leather collar bearing a small silver plate. She knelt before Atlas and fastened the new collar around his neck. "This is not for what you found," she said softly. "It is for what you refuse to abandon." Atlas looked up at her with calm curiosity before turning toward Claire, seeking nothing more than the familiar reassurance of her smile. She gently rested both hands against the sides of his face, her eyes shining with quiet gratitude. "You carried hope farther than I ever could," she whispered. Around them, no one applauded immediately. The silence itself became the tribute. The waves rolled softly against the harbor wall while gulls circled overhead beneath the clear Maine sky. Every person standing there understood that the most valuable thing rescued from the Atlantic had never been a yellow waterproof case filled with remarkable discoveries. It had been the simple reminder that integrity survives when even one faithful heart refuses to let go. And among the countless uniforms gathered that morning, the only soul who seemed completely unaware of his own importance was the German shepherd sitting peacefully beside the woman he had chosen, content at last because the journey he had guarded with unwavering devotion had finally led them both safely home. Several months later, winter gave way to the first quiet days of spring along the coast of Maine. The Atlantic looked gentler now, its restless gray waters softened by clear skies and a steady breeze that carried the scent of salt and pine through the harbor. Claire Whitmore stood once again aboard a research vessel, one hand resting lightly against the polished rail while the morning sun painted ribbons of gold across the waves. The yellow waterproof case rested securely inside the laboratory, no longer because anyone feared losing it, but because it had become a reminder that knowledge carried its own responsibility. Atlas sat at the bow exactly where he always preferred to be, his ears lifted toward the horizon, his gaze following the endless meeting place between sea and sky. Nothing about him suggested he had become a quiet legend among sailors, rescue crews, and scientists. He watched the ocean with the same calm curiosity he had possessed long before anyone knew his name. Commander Nathan Hayes joined Claire on deck, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee as he smiled toward the familiar silhouette of the German Shepherd. "He still checks every wave," Nathan said. Claire accepted the cup and smiled. "He believes every day deserves the same attention." Nathan looked across the water for a long moment before speaking again. "The Environmental Archive is already changing research programs all along the East Coast. Universities are requesting access. Conservation teams are expanding protected areas. Your work will help people for years." Claire lowered her eyes toward the rolling water below. "It was never only my work." Nathan followed her gaze toward Atlas. "I know." The ship continued steadily across the calm Atlantic, passing the same stretch of coastline where everything had nearly been lost. The sea looked peaceful, almost ordinary, as though it had forgotten the drifting raft, the cold night, and the silent promise made by one faithful companion who refused to leave. Claire quietly walked forward until she reached Atlas. She knelt beside him and gently adjusted the small silver tag resting against his leather collar. The polished metal reflected the morning light before settling once more against his chest. Atlas leaned into her hand with the quiet trust that had always existed between them. No words were necessary. Some bonds had long since moved beyond language. A pod of harbor porpoises surfaced briefly several hundred yards away, their graceful movements drawing smiles from the crew as cameras quietly captured the peaceful moment. Atlas watched them disappear beneath the waves before slowly resting his head against Claire's knee. The wind carried only the sound of gulls, distant buoys, and water brushing softly against the hull. Claire closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing deeply as gratitude replaced memories of uncertainty. She had once believed courage meant finding answers hidden beneath the ocean. Now she understood that courage sometimes looked much simpler. Sometimes it looked like remaining beside someone when leaving would have been easier. As the sun climbed higher, the vessel continued toward another day of discovery, leaving only a gentle wake stretching behind it across the shining Atlantic. Far above, a rescue helicopter crossed the distant sky before disappearing beyond the horizon, its quiet silhouette fading into the morning light. Claire watched until it was gone, then turned back toward the sea with Atlas faithfully beside her. The ocean still held countless mysteries waiting beneath its surface, but one truth had already revealed itself forever. The greatest treasures are not always the ones preserved inside carefully sealed cases or hidden beneath decades of water. Sometimes they walk beside us on 4 steady paws, asking for nothing except the chance to remain where love has called them to stay. And as the waves carried the ship forward beneath the endless American sky, the Atlantic seemed to whisper its own quiet blessing, reminding every soul aboard that some stories do not end with victory, nor with recognition. They end with grace.